Morning, everybody. All right, I'm continuing to talk about Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva Way, Chapter 6. So the first thing I want to do is recap what he's talked about so far. First thing is to recall your practice and your vow to engage in beneficial action. And this will fortify your effort when things are difficult. Second one is notice and bring to mind that when we are agitated, it doesn't feel good to be upset, and use this as a motivation to practice. Third one is cultivate patience in situations that are easy to work with. So when you get to the difficult ones, you've got some skill set to be able to support you. 4, recall that practicing in moments of difficulty will have the greatest effect on our cultivation of patience. So when things are tough, make more effort. 5, everything is interrelated and causally conditioned by other causes, situations, etc. Realizing this truth creates the space to help us cultivate patience with self and others. Okay. And 7, remember your vow to practice. Always go back to your vow. Okay. I find presenting this material to be extremely difficult. And I use this same chapter to work with my own anger a long time ago. And I found it really helpful, but giving talks on this is actually, I find, to be very difficult. Because Shantideva's teaching can appear to ignore the great harm caused by others' actions. And when this happens, we feel like we need to do something about that. But this is actually not Shantideva's intention in giving this teaching. What he's doing is he's offering us ways to think about difficult interactions that are going to create in us a spacious, compassionate, generous response. That's the point of the teaching. He's not saying don't do anything. He's saying cultivate a kind of practice that allows you to have a spacious, compassionate, generous, and wise response. So that's what this is all about, is how do you get there? How do you get to that place? Also, which we have not talked about and may not run into in this chapter, there are also sections of the Guide to the Bodhisattva Way that we would consider culturally inappropriate, for example, sexism. Nevertheless, we should not dismiss the teaching overall because of cultural biases from the 6th or 7th century between Buddhist monks and generally within that culture. And also, this can reflect, he's a different school of Buddhism than we practice in Soto Zen. Lots of overlap, but there's some underlying things that are different in his understanding. Okay, so because of all of this, because what Shantideva is talking about is our practice, not somebody else's, not changing somebody else, he throws the ball in our court. He says, sometimes when he does that, in particular in these verses I'm going to read today, you can feel like, oh, he's blaming you. He's saying, you're to blame for the problem that's happening. What he's actually saying is he's doing this because he's saying, we're doing the practice. It's our job to practice on ourselves. It's our job to engage in transformation of the self, not getting the other person to change. So this is about our practice. It's not about what somebody else is doing. So that's essentially what he's doing. And he may not do it in a way that exactly works for us as, 21st century Western psychologically based practitioners, but the underlying message I think, is absolutely appropriate. So his understanding is based in this larger framework of techniques concerned with how we transform in practice. That transformation is so that we can enact our Bodhisattva vow, so that we can bring forward our Bodhi minds and hearts. And developing this mind is key to being able to respond to any situation with equanimity, which is a good skill to have. It's also a very difficult state of mind to achieve. So I also want to remind us that this is one chapter out of 9 chapters, and patience is one of the 6 paramitas. So he also talks about generosity, morality, vigor, meditation, meditative absorption, and wisdom. So taken in its totality, the title of the text, A Guide to the Bodhisattva Way or A Guide to the Buddhist Path to Awakening, that's what he's talking about here. How do we do this, the totality of this? I'm only talking about chapter 6. So, all right, so today I want to talk about chapter 6, verses 42 to 51, which can't remember what my kind of summary of that is. So he's talking about our participation in conflicts that can arise with other people. So let me give you the first. I kind of flippantly titled this section, It Takes Two to Tango. Two to tango, two to tangle. Okay, so here's the verse. Shantideva says, previously, I must have caused similar harm to other sentient beings. Therefore, it is right for this harm to be returned to me, since I am the cause of injury to others. Now, I know this is not going to go over well. All right, so let's talk about this. So, as Shantideva discussed in the previous section, everything is causally connected. And because everything is causally connected, it's logical to assume that we may be the receiver of harm, but at some point in the past, we have also been the giver of harm. So that may have come about within the specific relationship that we're dealing with at that moment, or it may have come about from karmic residue in previous relationships. So everything is predicated upon causal conditions. Then somehow there is some connection between the self and other, even if we're not aware of that connection. All right, so that's maybe a little abstract, but that's where he's coming from here. Now, he also is probably referring to the circumstances of our rebirth. So it's taught in some schools of Buddhism, and we usually don't emphasize this in Zen Buddhism, although it is part of the teaching. It's part of the teaching because traditionally it's part of the teaching, but the question of rebirth is not so much emphasized in Zen, because in Zen we're talking about like just this moment, what's happening right now. So if we take care of business in the present moment, we don't have to worry so much about rebirth. But Shantideva did come from a school in which rebirth is probably an important part of the teaching. So in this model of rebirth, how we are reborn, what culture, what physical attributes we have, and emotional predispositions are the result of actions in a previous lifetime. So here he may be referring to that. Now, here's what I think is the most helpful thing and the best way to understand this verse for us. All of us have caused harm in the past in some way. All of us have done something that was unskillful. And as human beings, we say stupid things. Sometimes we get mad at people and we say things that are not skillful to that person, whatever it might be. We're greedy about something. I remember my dad died, and the day of his funeral, we come back and my nephew says to my mother, "Can I have my grandfather's watch?" That was a very unskillful thing and really upset my mom, but it wasn't intentional. Okay, so we all have done in the past unskillful things, and we make mistakes. And if we recall this in the situation that we're in, a difficult situation we're in with another person, who our inclination is to want to be judgmental about them, blaming to them. If we remember that we ourselves, maybe not that particular thing, but there's something else that we've certainly done in the past, it's a little humbling, to remember, oh yeah, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. So people do harmful things, and we've done harmful things. Therefore, being generous with another's delusion, or even however that is, being generous in our response is really helpful. Okay, so when I initially read this verse, previously I must have caused similar harm to other sentient beings, therefore it's right for this harm to be returned to me since I am the cause of injury of others. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, what about child abuse, right? What about other serious harm that people inflict upon each other? So you may observe that children cannot be held responsible for the harm that may befall them. But we have to remember, Shantideva is teaching this to people who want to practice the Dharma. So, he's saying to us, this is Bodhisattva practice. He's saying to us, if I'm in a conflict with somebody, maybe I should, instead of just immediately being judgmental and blaming and say it's the other person's fault, maybe I should consider the possibility that I too might be contributing to this problem. That gives me pause. That makes me think to myself, maybe I'm not being as skillful as I could be. Maybe there's something going on in my past. Maybe I'm bringing some karma to this situation of my own experience that is exacerbating the problem, even though it's not my intention. We talk about people having hooks with each other, right? It's like, well, this happened to this person in the past and that happened to me in the past or whatever, and bang, come together and there's a conflict. So can I take that and say, okay, maybe that's what's going on here, and I need to take a look at that. I need to see whether or not there's something I could do to de-escalate this and be more compassionate and generous. Because we are in relationship with other person. We are always in relationship with the other. So if we recall that all relationships are interconnected, even if we're not exactly sure what that interconnection is, then we may be able to de-escalate our response, because we immediately do not go to that place of blame. So this is about, like, most of these teachings are about break the cycle, give some space in there for our own immediate response that's not going to be helpful. So what he is not saying is, he's not saying don't set boundaries. But what he is saying is, if you're going to set boundaries based on wisdom and compassion, not based on some kind of knee-jerk blame, judgmental response. So if somebody says something to you that upsets you and you want to strike back, stop and think about the possible reasons for their behavior and see if you can conjure up some patience for that situation and generosity towards that person. If you're driving your car and somebody pulls in front of you and you think to yourself, that's so-and-so, what a selfish person, hey, maybe that person just found out that their partner is in the hospital. and they're freaking out and they're trying to get to the hospital, to the emergency room. Does that occur to us in those situations? No, we just get angry at the other driver. So it's like, maybe there's something going on we don't know about. Maybe it would be nice if we actually engaged in some more generosity and patience. We can also apply this logic, by the way, to ourselves. But in this case, Shantideva is talking about other people. So if another thing is to say, well, the person mean to me, maybe there are ways that I've been unskillful myself, and to kind of break the cycle that way. And, to be forgiving. I've been in situations where I've been unskillful and the other person was generous in their response. They were patient. They didn't strike back at me or try to hurt me or get after me or whatever. And that was so generous and kind of that person. And it was transformative for me. Suzuki Roshi says, let's give ourselves a big field. There are fences around the field, but, to give ourselves a big field. Okay, so that's that first verse that I want to talk about in this section. The next verse is verse 44. And my subtitle for that is Attachment to Our Idea of an Inherently Existing Self Results in Suffering. And here's the verse. If in blind attachment, I cling to this suffering abscess of a human form. Right? If in blind attachment, I cling to this suffering abscess of a human form, which cannot bear to be touched, with whom should I be angry when it is hurt? With whom should I be angry when it is hurt? This suffering abscess of a human form. Okay, if I can't bear to be touched, which means to have something happen that I don't like, right? If that's, then who should I blame when that happens? The person who is saying or doing something I don't like and causes me, or I am predisposed to lose my equanimity. Who should I blame for that? You know the answer, of course, right?
No one.
No one.
Right.
Okay. Well, I think Shantideva would say you need to practice a little more. Yeah. So, okay, so this does not mean that you passively let people harm you or others. This logic is meant to cause us to rethink our knee-jerk reaction to responses and reestablish our calm mind and heart. So he's trying to motivate us to take responsibility for our practice. I was a couple days ago on PBS, I was watching an interview with a woman who's a neuroscientist named Heather Berlin. And she has this theory about something she calls the perception box. And she said about this, when data coming in meets expectations, that's where we construct reality. When data coming in meets our perceptions, that's how we construct reality. So as human beings, and also probably all sentient beings, we're born in a body, and this body has senses, and that's essentially our data input ports, right? We have skin, touch, smell, etc. And even as kids, we have already developed a framework to make sense of what we're experiencing, right? It may not be, it's logical to us when we develop it. Personally, I like to think of the things that we develop as kids as kind of a hidden matrix. As adults, we're not even aware that we're kind of functioning on this structure that we built as kids to make sense of the world. And some ways we get really caught by that because we're so imprinted on this. So also, we seem to be born with a predisposition towards certain kinds of personality types. Like, there's some people who are like super optimistic. Some people. Then there are other people who are not, who are more pessimistic, you know. Some people are fearful, some people are very courageous and fearless people. So, we're all kind of like have this kind of different genetic makeup that we seem to come with. But we're all going to understand our experience through this thing that the scientist is calling the perception box. So this is our reality, and we deeply believe the truth of our reality, don't we? It's like we really believe what we believe about the nature of our experience. And so this view becomes the foundation of that how and why things happen in our mind, but it also becomes the foundation of our sense of self. And when people start messing with that, we get very upset because it's messing with some core understanding about the nature of who we are as a self. And in some ways, Shantideva is messing with that, right? Practice messes with that. And we're being asked to kind of expand this thing she's calling the perception box. We're being asked to expand this and try to step outside this kind of framework that we've created about the nature of how we understand reality. And we have to be careful about that, right? So we have to be, I've seen people in practice who do really kind of crazy radical things and end up kind of messing with their heads. So we're not talking about that. We're not talking about doing something that is. I had an acting class once when I was in college. I have a degree in theater. I had an acting class once, and the whole idea of the class was to break you down so that you no longer could hold on to whatever it was that was the problem that that class thought was a problem. There was a big problem with this, but doing this with a bunch of 18 to 20-year-olds or whatever, is that when people actually had these kind of breaks, the teacher didn't know how to put them back together again, right? So this is not about doing that to yourself. That's not a good thing. But it is about taking these techniques and saying, okay, should give me pause. Let me consider this, So this verse, if in blind attachment I cling to this suffering abscess of a human form, in other words, if in this blind attachment, this way in which I don't really understand what's going on here, I have this idea about the nature of my experience, and I'm really attached to that, which is very understandable. And I can't bear anything to get in the way of that story or narrative that I have, then, maybe I should look at that. Because when he says, with whom should I be angry when it is heard? The essential question there is, what should I be looking at? Should I be looking at the other person and blaming them? Or should I be considering the possibility that maybe my view of what's going on is a little screwy? Now, that's why we have teachers. That's why we have Sangha. That's why we have teachings. And it's also why we have in the West, we have psychotherapy and various other, ways that we talk about and work with our minds. But essentially what Shantideva is trying to do here is he's trying to say, not in a blaming way, even though he sounds kind of blaming, he's pretty hard-assed about this. We know at this point that that doesn't work very well. But it is helpful to say, what's going on here? Like, is it just all about them? That other person's got to change. It's their fault. They're the ones who are causing the problem. Or is it maybe I'm being thin-skinned? Maybe I'm the person who needs to kind of look at what they're doing and seeing what kind of healing do I need, right? And I think that's what he's talking about here. Okay, so Yeah. Now, the other thing that he's talking about here too is that, again, is going back to this idea that we are reborn in a human body, which generally is considered to be a really good thing in Buddhism, to be reborn in a human body, because it's the only rebirth where the causes and conditions are just right for us to wake up. So even though he's talking about this body as being this abscessed, uh, in a way that's a good thing, because we have the capacity and the tools to be able to wake up and cultivate these skillful means. Okay, so the next one is verse 51, and in verse 51, I'm calling it "who is harming whom." Okay, in the last few verses of this section, Shantideva is summarizing his teachings by commenting that because all things are co-produced from causal interbeing, then each party has to be in some way responsible for the conflict. And he says that if we are able to profit from this difficult interaction through practice, in other words, we meet a difficult situation and we're able to actually practice with it, we are profiting from that difficult situation, right? Because if it's not a difficult situation, we're not going to practice with it, are we? By and large, we're not. So these difficult situations are actually opportunities to practice. And earlier he says, in the heat of battle is when the most harm is done. The most harm to our delusion is done. So, these situations that are difficult for us, if we can meet those situations and actually practice, we're not overwhelmed by them, but we can actually practice with them, then, that's a good thing. So he says that we profit from these interactions through practice, but now this logic to me is not something I would ever think of. So he says, but because we're profiting from it, we're causing harm to the other person, right? And because they are agitated, and their agitation is caused by these, what he originally talked about in this section of these causal shared conditions, which creates a situation in which I, as the practitioner, profit from this interaction, which will result in the other person's further suffering. Now, I'm not so sure I agree with Shantideva's logic. Honestly, I think what he's doing is he's trying to make a neat little box for this section of verses to fit in. So he's trying to come up with some closure from the first verse about, everybody being to blame for the difficult situation. So the verse is, nevertheless, I should return the harm. Nevertheless, should I return the harm, it will not protect them either from this suffering and bad rebirth that they're going to have from all the bad feelings that have been brought up. Nevertheless, should I return the harm, it will not protect them either. But doing so, my conduct will deteriorate. In other words, if I reciprocate this perceived harm, my conduct will deteriorate, and hence this fortitude or this patience, my practice, will be destroyed. So he's saying that we might consider that by being patient, we'll create the conditions. Now, this isn't in the verses here, but it is in the totality of this, that we create the conditions for our own good rebirth, and the other person's unskillful actions will create for them the conditions for a not so auspicious rebirth. But if we respond by causing suffering, it's not going to help either one of us. So I think he's appealing to our self-protective impulses by saying fortitude will be destroyed. therefore we should continue to practice patience. Okay, for me personally, the jury's out on rebirth. I don't know if there's rebirth, and to be honest with you, I don't particularly care, which is a pretty heretical statement in some Buddhist schools, because I figure if I pay attention to the present moment and do my best in the present moment, that's the best I can do in that moment, and that the future will take care of itself. So that seems to me that, like I said, the jury's still out. But on the other hand, I certainly don't want to compound anyone's suffering because I'm being skillful. That to me is like completely weird. So I would think that by being skillful, what we would do is de-escalate the situation, not escalate the situation. So personally, my practice is not motivated about trying to avoid inauspicious rebirth. So I would suggest that we understand this verse to mean if we're skillful in our response and we employ practice and we awaken the Bodhi mind, our Bodhi mind, we will alleviate the suffering of others, not exacerbate it. I mean, that just makes sense to me. We are not going to exacerbate another person's suffering. We are going to help alleviate that suffering. If we're not skillful, if we will continue that cycle of ill will and suffering, and no one is going to profit from that. Even if the other person continues to be upset and have ill will, if we do this practice and we work with ourselves to transform our ill will, our discomfort, our suffering in that situation or with this person, that's what we can do. That's what our job is. Our job is not to make this other person into the person that we want them to be, so we're comfortable with that person. Our job is to work on our own practice so that we have mental stability and equanimity, generosity, some spaciousness in our response. So we don't want to continue a cycle of ill will and suffering. And I would say that while the situation Shantideva gives us as an example is plausible, it's also, as I said earlier, a good way for him to kind of sum up this little section that he's talking about. The other thing I'll add here is that when I was working with this stuff specifically, this is about the question of who profits from our practice. I think there's an intermediate step in here, which is something's going on well, I had a friend of mine who said one time, he said, your ideas are good, but your presentation sucks. So it's like, how do we get from that place of we want to express something, we want to say how something is, but we're also very upset in some ways. And so it means that our presentation sucks, right? But there's this way where when we're really upset, we're also fairly defensive when we're upset. So it's like when we're defensive and upset, we don't want somebody to tell us our presentation sucks, because that's just going to make us even more upset and even more unskillful in all likelihood. So where I came to is I said, well, okay, I want to be heard. I want to be heard. Does that make sense? It's like, I really would like the ideas that I have to be understood by other people and not have their response be, oh, well, I don't like the way this person acts, or I don't like the way this person is, so therefore I'm going to dismiss everything that they might be saying. Whether or not it's a good idea or not, doesn't matter. I just don't like their affect. So there's this way in which you may change your affect because you want to get something. Now, doesn't sound very Buddhist. Aren't we all supposed to be changing our affect because we want to benefit all beings? But maybe you can't change your affect because you want to benefit all beings, because that just makes you mad, right? Because you feel like people are saying, well, what's wrong with you? You're not benefiting all beings. Your practice isn't, we don't like your affect, whatever it is. Well, then you're just more upset about what's going on because you feel very criticized. So personally, I'd say I think it's okay that there's an intermediate step in there where you do something that's fairly self-serving, which is I'm going to change my affect so I can get what I want. And what I want in the situation is either people get off my back, or that there's some way that I, can be perceived in a more skillful way. What happens in that situation, or at least this is what happened for me, is that what happens is that as you do that, it transforms itself from something you want to do to get something to something you just want to do because it benefits self and other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's like, it's okay that maybe you need to have this intermediate step. And remember, I said, Shantideva was talking about patience as an antidote to anger, but it can also be an antidote to greed. It can be an antidote to delusion in the sense of not doing anything. It can be antidote to many things that we engage in. So it's okay to come up with these intermediate steps so that you can give your poor little abscessed self a chance to heal, and to find a strategy in which you don't feel like you're being squished like a bug all the time because people don't like your whatever it is. So I just want to say that. Now, I'm going to summarize the teachings that he gave today. When we are experiencing a conflict with someone, it is usually because the causal conditions of both of our experiences, both people's experiences, clash with each other and conflict arises. Recalling this should help us de-escalate our agitation and have a clearer, humbler, and more spacious response to the person with whom we are experiencing problems. So I think that's what the first thing is he's saying. Then he says, just being in a human body with our perceptual conditions causes us to become attached to our idea of self and reality, which go together. And that's going to color how we understand our relationships. So recognizing this, we may reconsider our desire to place blame upon another. In fact, our clinging to a particular idea of self is a cause of suffering that we bring upon ourselves. Okay? And then the third thing that I think he's saying in this section is that as a practitioner develops more patience, generosity, and wisdom, they are doing it at the expense of the other person's agitation, because we learn patience when we're struggling with impatience. This in turn will cause them, the upset person, to have an unfortunate rebirth. Now, I've already just said what I think about the logic of this. Nevertheless, we can't use this as an excuse not to practice, because my agitation will disturb my own mental stability, and that can't be good for either person. So we'll take that last part and hold on to that and forget the first part. Okay, so I want to remind you that the whole point of Shantideva's teaching is to encourage us, not blame ourselves, but to encourage us to practice, to take up this practice of personal transformation by changing our view. And it's to remind us to continuously strive to cultivate the means to enact our Bodhi mind, the means to enact Bodhisattva practice, the means to benefit all beings. Thank you.